And welcome to this first episode and this experiment that we named Beyond Curiosity, research briefings from the participatory arts field. And the first episode will revolve around cultural values and democracy. For those who are not that familiar with Amateo activities, here's a brief presentation of Amateo, that is a European network very active in the voluntary and amateur arts. And as you know or may not, Amateo sees active participation in the arts as a core value for a free and open society. So the relationship between active cultural participation and the activity of Amateo is very clear. Well, about the research activity of Amateo, it basically revolves around three pillars. And the first one is the creation of a questionnaire that is designed to be used in any European country and help evaluate the impact of participation in culture. And so have an overview of different aspects of active participation with people who are actively involved in cultural activities. This questionnaire is still in a beta test mode, and we hope to develop it very soon. The second pillar of Amateo research activity is publications, and those are three books three translations from other languages, one from Croatia, one from Slovenian, and one from Czech. Those books are available in our website, I suppose. And then the third pillar is a database that gathers around 100 entries, and this is designed to benefit researchers, students, and practitioners on the core aspects of active cultural participation, so helping monitor the progress of research and its coverage throughout Europe. This database should be updated until the end of the year with other 200 entries that will help researchers or practitioners to have a clear idea about what's going on in research about cultural activities. But now let me go further and see what's the program of this presentation. I divided my presentation in 4 chapters. Defining cultural participation, defining democratic outcomes, impacts of cultural participation on democracy, and future directions. This is a very important topic, and let me delve into it. The first quote I got for defining cultural participation comes from a book, Cultural Policies in Europe, a Participatory Turn. And this is very interesting because the analysis of the compendium of cultural policies and trends shows that 80% of the 24 European countries analyzed in our study include promoting cultural participation as a main cultural policy objective. I'd like to say so far so good, but there are ambiguities, and for instance, to what is participation mainly referring within cultural policy documents? So you see the first place is audience development, and the second one is consultation, so a dialogue with audiences. Just the third place for amateur practices, that it's the core business of Amateo, and then the share of decision in artistic processes, and then the share of decision in programming processes. So what's going on here? With the cultural participation, we are referring to a multitude practices, and so we have to clear the stage for reading data in a correct way. For instance, as you read here, audience development and amateur practices refer to very different outputs. This slide doesn't apply perfectly just to amateur arts, but you get an idea about different practices according to creative control, lower creative control and a higher creative control. From reception, experience, interpretation, also the role is a spectator, until the actually participant when they have an important creative role in the cultural participation practice. This is a very interesting slide because there are very different patterns. There are very different patterns about policy paradigms that are referred to cultural participation, and they are especially two very different contexts. For instance, there is the excellence paradigm that was created after the World War II, and then followed by the cultural democratization in the 60s, and then finally cultural democracy in the 70s, and then the creative economy in the 80s. You can see, you already can see different values according to those cultural policy paradigms. So, for instance, in cultural democratization, the goals of the policies are easy access and low ticket prices. You see the key role of the programmer and decentralized educational services, and so on. They promote excellence for all, to critic and engage communities, but always on a more passive role. While in cultural diplomacy, cultural democracy, that have among the values amateurism, people empowerment, voluntary work, cultural diversity, cultural rights, and the commons, you can see more active participation by the people, by the commons, and this movement, it's one of the paradigms that is a goal for amateurism. We can define cultural democracy like this. I took some quotes to have a clearer idea of what the cultural democracy paradigm is. And the cultural democracy postulates the possibility of each social group obtaining recognition for its own cultural practices, considered illegitimate under models of cultural excellence and cultural democratization, and or unprofitable by the economic system, and gaining support for them. I mean, unprofitable by the economic system, at least directly, because amateurism develops personal skills that can be used by the by an economic approach. Then, in recent years, cultural democracy has found a new advocate with the rise of the cultural commons approach. Its original purpose was to emphasize the empowerment of citizens as active subjects and stakeholders in public policies by giving value to assembled decisions taken by active collectives and citizens. So we moved from a paradigm of excellence and then to cultural democratization to actually those forms that enable commons and practitioners to have a stronger voice in the cultural realm. And what does it mean to have a stronger voice in the cultural realm? Those are the most frequent cultural policy objectives justifying participatory policies and the projects. So why participatory projects are funded? The first one is still democratization and audience development. So related to still related to cultural democratization, then social cohesion, then cultural diversity, and then cultural democracy, cultural rights, then artistic production and creation, and then empowerment and emancipation. So those are the most frequent cultural policy objectives justifying participatory policies and projects and, of course, fundings. What does it mean, this? It means that it's easy for especially the public sector to find connections with other policy fields like personal development, education, lifelong learning, and having, of course, economic impacts, health and well-being, clinical and not clinical aspects, resilience, so crisis response and recovery, identity related to local image and cultural heritage, social inclusion, inequalities and disabilities, and social cohesion, so community building until in very high-risk areas, the cultural diplomacy projects. Those are topics that are very interesting for active cultural participation, and I'd like to go deeper on those in further meetings that we will schedule in the next year or so. There is a problem still about this, and this problem is the so-called policy attachment. I quote Emanuela Belfiore with his article, The Social Impacts of Arts, Myth or Reality. She's very critical about the measuring systems of cultural participation. We will develop this content further. Cultural policy is considered, at least traditionally, the Cinderella of the public policy sphere. As an area of low priority in political discourse, the cultural sector has only ever attracted a modest proportion of public expenditure. Public spending on the arts is still significantly lower proportionately to spending on other sectors of the welfare system, like education, social and health services, etc. Nevertheless, there is a little doubt that in recent years, the arts and culture have gained a much more central role in public policy debate. So crucial in this development is the fact that the cultural sector's higher degree of visibility in the political arena has been accompanied by the increased capacity of the sector to tap into other public policy budgets. Clive Gray defines this phenomenon as policy attachment. So what does it mean, policy attachment? It's in short, it represents a strategy that allows a weak policy sector with limited political clout to attract enough resources to achieve its policy objectives. So we all know this approach. And from one hand, it's a very welcome approach because it creates connection between active cultural participations and other realms, cultural or not. But there's a dark side of policy attachment. As a result of these developments, the subsidized cultural sector is now expected to deliver on the basis of social and economic policy targets that relate to social inclusion and the local economic development strategies already in place. So it's a goal-oriented on the basis of other social and economic policy targets and not process-oriented. A primary consequence of the attachment of cultural policy to other spheres of public policy making was the fact that this encouraged expectations that publicly found arts and culture ought to address the priorities of those other policy areas and should actively contribute to achieving their objectives. So, this is an introduction to what to expect from and the ambiguities of cultural participation. We saw that there are not reliable data giving the different interpretations of active cultural participations. And then from a policy point of view, there is something ambiguous related to that category that is policy attachment. Starting to define democratic outcomes, not outputs, outcomes. One important limitation of the current literature on the social impacts of the arts is the underlying assumption that the same type of impacts will accrue from different types of cultural activities on different types of audience participants. Another complication is represented by the fact that the phrase social impacts of the arts is usually employed with reference to a wide group of evaluation methods. And I'd like to work on the evaluation methods in another meeting, ranging from evaluation of the impacts of a single project or organization, all the way to the effects of culture-led urban regeneration. Emanuela Belfiore is referring especially to urban regeneration, but there are other realms that can be taken into account. So the difficulty of identifying and classifying the supposed positive impacts of the arts is also reflected in the persisting dissatisfaction with current methodologies for impact measurement and evaluation. And we all experience this day by day. Recently, in 2023, a very interesting book was published, and it's this one, Culture and Democracy, The Evidence. I'd like to take some, to share some notes here about this book because it's very useful. You could not find a lot of data in the sense of percentages, because we will see it later on. But there are some, as I told you, there are some problems with current measurements, and so we can still find correlations and not causations in data about active cultural participation. I need to say that the biggest data set comes from Eurostat, and Eurostat data on cultural participation, I mean the last available data on cultural participation, dates back to 2015. At the end of 2023, so in December, Eurostat should have published the result of a new survey, which includes a module on cultural participation. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, this was postponed to February 2024. So if we discuss an important, relevant data set, we are still talking about data coming from 2015. So basically, the landscape has changed a lot, and I honestly don't know how useful it could be talking about data from 2015. There are several variables related to cultural participation, and the one module carefully crafted around active cultural participation, so amateurism. And we are still waiting for results about COVID-19 pandemic effects and technological developments. Those are in the future directions of research in the active cultural participation area. So, how cultural participation relates to democratic outcomes? Whilst there are several frameworks for measuring democracy, there are a few that make the link with cultural participation. The indicator framework on culture and democracy that has been developed by the Council of Europe does include both dimensions. It individuates various dimensions of the cultural activity process, so artistic expression and creation, interest in foreign cultures, online creativity, passive cultural participation, etc., and measure their association with measures of democracy, so government capability, political competition, checks and balances, transparency, rule of law, individual freedoms. I took note about some indicators, and percentages are not indicators. I gathered many more indicators about democracy and crossing them with the so-called democratic outcomes. And of course, because it's about cultural values. And so, what are the cultural values belonging to active cultural participation? Now, when we different research, when we read different pieces of research, the cultural values related to democracy values are differently shaped. So I gather some more, and there is equality, freedom, inclusivity and diversity, rule of law, of course, civic responsibility, openness to dialogue and debate, transparency, human rights, social justice, and national identity. And with national identity, I don't mean actually patriotism, but a sense of belonging to a larger community. We could relate them to the connected policy fields I mentioned earlier. And the analysis of the IFCD dataset shows that overall there is a strong positive relationship. So to translate in a statistical language, statistically significant correlation, so not causation, correlation, between the general culture indicator and the democracy indicators. This means that countries which score higher than average in the cultural indicator also score higher in the democracy indicator. Those are the cultural participation and democracy indicators as reported in IFCD data. So we have civic indicators that are artistic expression and creation, and this also includes amateur arts, interest in foreign cultures, non-partisan involvement, online creativity, online cultural participation, passive cultural participation, and the students in the arts. Those are the indicators that have been used by the IFCD to study the data and crossing them with democracy indicators. So related to political participation, so institutionalized participation and non-institutionalized participation. What are the outcomes of those of this data crossing? This is a correlation between culture and democracy indicators. You see the blue line for EU countries and the red line for non-EU countries. You can see now democracy and culture representative, and so the more culture is sustained, the more the level of democracy is better. So those dots are the countries, and you can have a better view of this. Of these outcomes in the book Culture and Democracy, the Evidence. But this is, generally speaking, the relation between culture and democracy. I'd like to highlight the cultural participation and democracy outcomes, and those are democracy and cultural participation. So you can see a relation between those two data. They are not that different. It seems that in non-EU countries, those correlation between cultural participation and democracy indicators are a little bit stronger because you can see the difference of the line. They are not parallel lines. So it seems that in non-EU countries, those indicators have much more values. But there are three big outliers, and so those are, this is the graphic. If we eliminate, if we can get rid of those three outliers. And those three outliers are UK, Norway, and Switzerland. So this is the main study about cultural participation indicators and the study of level of democracy. All indicators are positively correlated with each other, suggesting that countries with above average performance in one indicator also shows above average performance in others. And the indicator sets and studies outlined so far demonstrate the existence of a positive relationship between cultural participation and democratic and civic participation. However, they do not always support conclusions about the causal relationship. Now I have to repeat that we are still waiting from an updated data set from Eurostat, and I still don't know how they will be shaped up, but there is the potential to find a very clear causal relationship. Yes, okay, I can say something else more about this. But the third part is, why does cultural participation influence democratic and civic outcomes? I mean, we started from trying to define what cultural participation is when reading data sets. And then we tackled the problem of data and how to use them. So now, why does cultural participation influence democratic and civic outcomes? There are three main reasons. The first one is bonding, the role that cultural activities can play in developing social competencies and group identities as foundations of civic and democratic engagement. Key factors include the role that participation in cultural activities play in enhancing social confidence and belonging alongside social skills such as self-reflection and communication. The second one is bridging. So the role that cultural participation can play from a bridging between social groups and mediate cohesive societies. Key factors here include the role that cultural participation can play to enhance understanding of different social perspectives. So bonding, bridging, and linking. The role that cultural participation can play in helping to create opportunities for groups to engage with and influence civic and democratic institutions and decision making. Key factors for this dimension include examples where cultural organizations have shaped decision making. Those are three qualitative indicators of how and why cultural participation, and especially active cultural participation, influences democratic and civic outcomes. And that brings us to a limitation. So, however, the principal limitation in this evidence-based centers on the extent to which these dimensions translate into civic and democratic behaviors in practice. Much of the evidence is based on small-scale studies of art initiatives that directly aim to support or mediate a relationship with civic and democratic behaviors. That applies to every connection with other policy fields. In the field of health and well-being, I was discussing some results, and you know, if you present percentages, the problem is that the dataset is insufficient or unreliable. So statistically speaking, you have to hide yourself behind some generally accepted common good sense, like you know, active participatory arts can improve up to a percentage, and that doesn't mean anything because up to percentage it could mean zero, and so it's very honest. Try to work around correlations and not causations in reading data sets. And that brings us to the future directions. Those are, I gather from the bibliography you have received, and those are the future directions of cultural policies studies. And those are 10 entries that can be related to active cultural participation, and active cultural participation can have a strong voice in tackling those challenges. And so the first one is digital integration focus. And this is particularly important also about participation because we don't have many open public places where people can share arts and can participate in the field of arts. Then diversity and inclusion focus, and that's a core value of active cultural participation, as we had seen earlier. And then to increase community engagement, of course, another core value. Health and well-being focus, and there are very interesting correlations between health and well-being focus and active participation in arts and culture. Skill development initiatives, another about lifelong education and education and personal growth and development. Six, the facilitation of cultural exchange, of course, also between amateur artists. Integration of sustainability practices, and this is a big focus, especially in the European Union, and especially because COP28 is ongoing. The eighth is promoting democracy, and we have seen now some strategies that can be adopted. Then promoting intergenerational projects. And so this creating a dialogue for social cohesion, and also promoting cross-disciplinary collaboration between arts, and so music and theater, and make amateur artists in the field music, theater, cinema, or audiovisual sector. And promoting cross-disciplinary collaboration can create a stronger community of active cultural participation citizens and a very strong group.